Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world.
Thank you for having me.
Today's deep dive explores recapturing democracy, neoliberalization, and the struggle for alternative urban futures by Mark Purcell.
It is quite a title, but the core ideas are incredibly urgent.
They really are. The book examines how neoliberal economic logic has reshaped modern cities, turning urban space into a competitive marketplace rather than a shared democratic environment.
Okay, let's unpack this, because right out of the gate, this premise presents a fascinating paradox for anyone who lives in or even just visits a modern city.
It really does.
We are fundamentally conditioned to think of cities as the ultimate democratic spaces, right?
Right, yeah.
You elect a mayor, you vote on city council members, you might, attend a raucous town hall meeting about a zoning change. It feels loud, it feels participatory.
It feels like democracy in action. Exactly. But what if the very structure of these modern cities quietly prioritizes global markets over local citizens? What if the architecture of urban governance is actually designed on a systemic level to bypass you?
This raises an important question, and it really is the central axis we are going to be spinning around today. The crisis in perception here is that we look at a specific urban issue, let's say a sudden spike in luxury condo development while affordable housing vanishes.
Which happens everywhere.
Everywhere. Or maybe a public square being handed over to a private management company. We tend to view these as isolated individual policy failures. We tell ourselves that the city council just made a bad call or the mayor is out of touch.
We blame the specific people in the room.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Purcell's work suggests we are looking at the completely wrong layer of reality. The crisis emerges because cities are widely described to us as democratic spaces, while their underlying economic design strictly limits meaningful public control.
So the foundation is the issue.
Yes. And if that structural foundational layer remains invisible to you, you spend all of your civic energy arguing about individual symptoms, rather than examining the incentive architecture that is actually dictating the choices our cities make.
And before we dive into the mechanics of that invisible architecture, I need to lay down a very clear marker for you, the listener.
Good idea.
The source material we are exploring today, Mark Purcell's text, is highly analytical, but it is also explicitly anti-capitalist and anti-neoliberal in its framework. It carries strong political and economic critiques.
Very strong.
So our mission on this deep dive is absolutely not to take a side. We are not here to endorse a left-wing or right-wing political agenda, and we aren't here to validate or debunk the author's personal political conclusions.
Right. Our goal as your objective guides is to impartially map out Purcell's theoretical architecture.
We want to synthesize his arguments and break down his terminology so that you can clearly understand these invisible systems he's describing. We are handing you a new theoretical lens to look through.
Whether you ultimately agree with what that lens reveals about the city you live in is entirely up to you.
Let's start by looking at those rules, which brings us to the first major conceptual hurdle, the terror of neoliberalization, and how it actively re-engineers the physical city.
Yes, the terror.
We need to define our terms here, because neoliberalism is one of those words that gets thrown around constantly. Usually it's used as a catch-all synonym for free markets or laissez-faire capitalism.
Just the general idea that the government should step back, cut red tape, and let businesses do their thing.
Right. But Purcell argues that viewing it simply as a withdrawal of the state is a fundamental misconception.
It is a massive misconception, and it hides how the system actually functions.
Go ahead.
First, notice the terminology here. Purcell prefers the term neoliberalization ending with a Z-A-T-I-O-N.
Making it a verb, essentially.
Yes, an active process. He uses this to emphasize that we are not talking about a finished, static state of being. It is an active, ongoing, fitful, and sometimes very uneven project. It is constantly recalibrating itself based on resistance and crises.
So it's not just cutting taxes and walking away.
Not at all. The core of this project is not merely freeing the market from the state. It is an ambitious project of restructuring all of social life. Our institutions, our physical spaces, our legal frameworks, so that they are subjected to the logic of competitive relations.
It's like rewriting the rules of a board game while people are still trying to play it.
That's a great way to look at it. The absolute dominant imperative becomes economic growth and capital accumulation. Everything else, social equity, environmental sustainability, community cohesion, all of that is strictly secondary. Or it's only valuable if it supports that primary goal of growth.
And this brings us to what Purcell calls the myth of the disappearing state.
A very persistent myth.
If you watch political debates, the narrative is almost always framed as a tug of war. Either you want more government or you want more free market. The assumption is that under neoliberalization, the government shrinks. It slashes welfare, deregulates, and leaves.
But according to this text, the state doesn't disappear at all. It just violently changes its job description.
So what does the state do then?
The state is still incredibly powerful and heavily involved in the economy, but its interventions have been fundamentally redirected. Under previous economic models, the state often acted as a provider of social reproduction.
Meaning they directly built public housing, ran public hospitals, and provided a robust social safety net.
Exactly. Under neoliberalization, the state stops acting as a social safety net and starts acting as an active assistant to capital.
Let's make that concrete. What does the state acting as an assistant to capital actually look like on a city street?
Consider housing policy. Instead of a city or federal government using public funds to build, own, and maintain public housing complexes for low-income residents, a neoliberalized state might instead offer housing vouchers or tax subsidies to low-income renters.
Wait, hold on. Let me play devil's advocate here.
Go for it.
Isn't a housing voucher still the government helping a poor person pay rent? How is that assisting capital? It looks like a classic social program.
It functions as a social program on the surface. But structurally, the mechanics are entirely different. By providing a voucher, the state is heavily subsidizing the private housing market.
Ah, I see.
It allows low-income people to act as consumers within a private market, which keeps that market functioning at maximum profitability for private landlords and developers. The state is using public money to guarantee private rental incomes.
That makes sense. The money flows right through the renter and into the private market?
Furthermore, we see this explicitly in urban development. Local and state governments frequently act as the principal investors taking on the highest risks for private megaprojects.
Like sports stadiums.
Exactly. They use public funds to build the infrastructure for stadiums, convention centers, or massive corporate campuses. They engage in public-private partnerships where the taxpayers shoulder the financial liability if the project fails.
But the private developers reap the profits if it succeeds.
Yes. The state is heavily involved, but it is involved in smoothing the path for private capital accumulation.
So the game isn't that the government has left the building. The government is still at the table, but it's quietly sliding chips to the wealthiest players to keep the game moving.
That is exactly the dynamic.
But how did local city governments end up in this specific role? Because if we look back a few decades, cities operated very differently. Purcell spends a lot of time on a historical shift from what he calls spatial Keynesianism to the modern fiscal squeeze.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to look at the macroeconomic framework that dominated from the post-World War II era up until the crises of the 1970s. This was the era of Keynesian economics, and specifically spatial Keynesianism.
Okay, let's define that.
During this time, national governments in the West operated largely on a model of spatial equalization.
Meaning they wanted to make sure different geographic regions had a relatively equal baseline of economic health?
Correct. The federal government would collect massive amounts of revenue centrally and then distribute it back down to states and local municipalities based on social need.
So if a particular industrial city in the Midwest was struggling with high unemployment and poverty,
The national government would direct funds there. They would build infrastructure, fund social programs, and try to act as an automatic stabilizer to prevent that region from collapsing.
they viewed it as their responsibility to manage uneven geographical development.
Yes.
It's sort of like a family budget. The parents, the national government, look at all their kids. They see which kid needs braces, which kid needs new shoes, and they distribute the household income accordingly so everyone has a baseline standard of living, regardless of whether that specific kid earned the money.
That is a perfect analogy.
But then the 1970s hit, we get stagflation, economic crises, and the neoliberal project begins to dismantle that family budget. What happens to the cities?
The central feature of this dismantling is devolution. National governments decide they are going to offload the responsibility for welfare, social services, and infrastructure down to the local level.
They pass the buck.
They tell the cities, you are now in charge of solving poverty, housing, and transit in your jurisdiction. But, and this is the critical catch, they offload the responsibilities while simultaneously cutting the massive federal funding pipelines that used to pay for them.
So the city is suddenly handed a massive list of expensive chores, but their allowance is permanently revoked.
Precisely. And the limited federal funding that is still available is often transformed from need-based grants to competitive grants.
Meaning the cities have to fight for it.
Cities now have to compete against each other, proving they are a good investment or that they have innovative pro-business policies in order to win federal dollars.
This is the fiscal squeeze. The city is caught in a terrifying vice. On one side, they have rising social costs. Infrastructure is aging, homelessness is rising, schools need funding.
And on the other side, their traditional national funding pipeline has been shut off.
So what is the rational response of a city government in that vice? They have to generate the revenue locally, and the only way to do that is to expand their local tax base by attracting private investment.
Which fundamentally transforms the psychology and the function of the city. Local politicians can no longer afford to act merely as democratic representatives weighing the diverse desires of their constituents. The structural pressure forces them to become entrepreneurial economic managers.
They realize they're in a global competition against every other city on Earth to attract mobile capital.
Yes,
Let me push back on this again because this is where a lot of people might get tripped up.
sure.
If I'm the mayor of a struggling city and I court a massive tech company to build a factory or a headquarters in my downtown, that brings jobs, it brings construction contracts, it brings property tax revenue that I can theoretically use to fund the schools.
True.
Why is this competitive drive framed by Purcell as a negative constraint? Isn't attracting business a good thing for a city?
It's not that bringing in jobs is inherently malicious. It's about what the desperation to bring in those jobs forces the city to sacrifice. Because capital is globally mobile, meaning a massive corporation can easily choose to build its headquarters in Austin or Seattle or Dublin or Singapore. The city is constantly terrified of capital flight.
Capital flight, just the money leaving.
Right. If a mayor wants to raise corporate taxes to genuinely fund those schools, or if they want to enact strict environmental regulations to protect the local river, or mandate that a new development must include 50% affordable housing,
Developers will balk.
the developers and corporations will simply say, no thanks, we'll take our billions of dollars to a city with fewer rules and lower taxes.
So the threat of capital leaving is the disciplinary force. It acts as an invisible electric fence around what a mayor is actually allowed to do.
Exactly. And this desperation completely alters how a city views its own physical space. This is where Purcell introduces a critical distinction between exchange value and use value applied to urban real estate.
Let's linger on this because it's vital. In standard real estate development and city zoning, there is a very common phrase: highest and best use.
Yes, you hear that a lot in planning meetings.
It sounds incredibly objective. If you have a vacant lot in the middle of a downtown, the city planners want it to be put to its highest and best use. But what does that phrase actually mean in a neoliberalized city?
In this system, highest and best use has nothing to do with what the local community might actually need. It strictly means whatever development will generate the maximum financial return, the highest exchange value. It is the value of the land as a financial asset to be bought, sold, and taxed.
So if a neighborhood has a vacant lot and the local residents desperately need a community garden or a cooperative daycare center or deeply affordable housing.
Those things have immense use value.
Exactly. They are incredibly valuable to the people living there to survive and thrive, but they don't generate massive profits or high property tax increments.
Right. And therefore, according to the logic of the market and the desperate, revenue-starved city planners, a community garden is an inefficient use of that space.
Even though the community wants it.
The market dictates that the land's true destiny is to become a luxury condominium complex or a high-end commercial retail space, because that maximizes the exchange value.
The ideology structurally trains policymakers to favor the maximization of property values over the maximization of human use values.
It's not necessarily that the planners are evil people who hate gardens. It's that the fiscal survival of the city has been tied entirely to maximizing real estate exchange values.
So what does this all mean? If the city is trapped in this global Hunger Games for capital, constantly terrified of scaring away investors and desperately trying to maximize the financial yield of every square inch of pavement, what actually happens to the average voter who just wants that community garden?
This transitions us perfectly into understanding the democratic squeeze.
Because Purcell suggests something quite dark here about how city planners and economic managers view our votes.
To understand the democratic squeeze, we have to look at what geographer Byron Miller calls limited capacity urban governance. We just established the immense structural constraints on local decision makers. Because they are terrified of capital flight, the actual menu of policy options they can realistically offer to voters is severely restricted.
Right. It's like walking into a massive restaurant. You sit down, the menu is huge, and you're ready to order a complex, fulfilling meal. But the waiter leans in and whispers, actually, the kitchen is only serving plain toast or tap water tonight. Anything else will cause the restaurant to go bankrupt.
That is a perfect analogy.
You technically have a choice between the toast and the water, but the choices that actually matter to you are crossed off before you even sat down.
You can vote for Mayor A or Mayor B. But if both Mayor A and Mayor B know that implementing redistributive social policies or aggressively preserving uncommodified public space will trigger a credit rating downgrade for the city and cause investors to flee, then neither of them will offer those options.
So the democracy is effectively neutralized.
As Miller argues, in a system where economic growth is viewed as an absolute, non-negotiable imperative, democracy is increasingly squeezed into irrelevance. True democracy requires that citizens have the power to choose among a variety of real, viable, and fundamentally different pathways for their community.
If the global market dictates that only pro-business, entrepreneurial policies are viable, the democratic process is hollowed out. It becomes a performance.
Yes.
But it gets depper than just a restricted menu. The text argues that the actual mechanical process of democracy is viewed by the system as a fundamental liability, which is a wild concept. We are taught that the democratic process is sacred. How does it become a liability?
Think about what real, robust democracy actually looks like. It is incredibly messy. It requires public hearings, transparent disclosures of documents, vigorous debate, protests, counterproposals, and lengthy compromises. It takes a massive amount of time.
It's slow.
It is painfully slow.
Mm-hmm.
But in a globalized, hyper-competitive market, time is capital. Cities believe they have to act with lightning speed to secure investment.
Give me an example of how that plays out.
Let's say a massive multinational tech conglomerate announces they are going to build their second global headquarters, bringing 50,000 jobs. They're taking bids from 20 cities. They need guaranteed tax breaks, infrastructure commitments, and zoning clearances within 60 days.
A city cannot afford the luxury of a 6-month democratic deliberation process to ask the residents how they feel about the traffic impacts.
The perception among the economic managers is that democracy is just inefficient. It's a cumbersome luxury.
So what do?
To bypass the unpredictable public and speed up these massive decisions, power is systematically shifted away from elected bodies, like the city council, where politicians actually have to answer to angry voters.
And it's shifted toward what Purcell calls oligarchic institutions.
Yes.
Let me stop you there. Oligarchic institutions sounds like something out of a geopolitical spy thriller. Are we talking about a secret cabal in a smoke-filled room, or are we just talking about standard, boring city planning boards?
It is usually the latter, but the structural effect is profound. We are talking about appointed councils, quasi-public agencies, economic development corporations, and public-private partnership boards.
Boring administrative names.
Very boring. But these are bodies often composed of business leaders, real estate developers, and appointed experts. They are not directly elected by the public. They frequently operate behind closed doors, or at least without the same rigorous transparency and public comment requirements as the city council.
Yet these are the entities tasked with making the most massive, consequential decisions about how billions of dollars of urban space are developed.
Power is insulated from democratic pressure so that it can operate at the speed of the market.
And Purcell argues this shift is justified by a very specific ideological view of who the public actually is. There is a fascinating breakdown in the text using Greek etymology, contrasting the concepts of the idiot and the citizen. Tell me about this.
In ancient Greece, the word idiot did not mean someone who lacked intelligence. It referred to a completely private person, someone whose actions were motivated solely by their own individual, private self-interest, rather than the affairs of the state.
And the citizen.
A citizen was defined as someone whose actions and political engagements were motivated by the common good of the polis, the broader community.
So, a functioning democracy requires transforming individuals from self-interested idiots into community-minded citizens. You have to care about the pothole on the other side of town, not just the one in your driveway.
Right, but Purcell argues that neoliberalism does the exact opposite. Because the fundamental logic of neoliberalism treats everyone primarily as an economic actor, a consumer, a taxpayer, a property owner whose primary goal is to maximize their own individual utility. It structurally transforms citizens back into idiots.
The system tells us daily that our only valid interaction with the city is as a consumer demanding good services for our tax dollars, or as a homeowner trying to protect our property values.
And if the system views the public simply as an aggregate mass of self-interested consumers, then city governments feel totally justified in bypassing them. If we're all just selfish idiots, why would the city trust us to design complex, long-term urban policy?
It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And this distrust of the local public leads directly to a phenomenon known as fast policy transfer.
Yes, fast policy transfer. Because local economic managers don't want to engage their own messy, unpredictable residents to generate custom, democratically derived solutions to city problems, they look elsewhere. They simply copy and paste prepackaged, competitive policy models from other cities.
It's policy by franchise.
That's it exactly. A city will adopt enterprise zones or complex tax increment financing schemes or zero-tolerance policing models. Not because the local public organically debated and demanded these specific tools, but because a panel of consultants noted that these policies successfully attracted capital in a rival city.
It is governance by benchmarking rather than governance by democratic will.
Exactly.
So if we pause and look at the picture we've painted so far, it's heavy. The city is structurally forced to compete globally for capital. Real estate is prioritized for its financial yield over its human use. Democracy is sidelined because it's too slow and unpredictable. Power is handed to unelected boards, and we, the inhabitants, are treated merely as self-interested consumers.
It feels like a totally locked-in system.
But the second half of Purcell's book doesn't leave us in that despair. He outlines a theoretical framework for resistance, which brings us to the counterproject, radical democratization and the right to the city. I want to shift the energy here because there is actual hope in this resistance.
This is where the text pivots from diagnosis to potential remedy. The counterproject begins with a demand for what Purcell calls radical democratization. Now, this doesn't just mean ensuring everyone has the right to vote in a mayoral election or putting more polling places in neighborhoods.
What does it mean then?
Radical democratization requires us to completely reject the traditional liberal separation between the public sphere, where politics happens, and the private sphere, where the economy happens.
Meaning, we currently accept a boundary line, we get a democratic vote on who the sheriff is or who sits on the school board, but we largely assume we have no democratic right to decide how a massive private corporation develops a 100-acre tract of downtown real estate because that is private business.
Exactly. But radical democratization insists that economic relations are power relations. The decision of a corporation to close a factory or a developer to bulldoze an affordable neighborhood for luxury retail has a far more profound impact on the daily lives of citizens than almost anything the city council does.
So if we want true democracy, those economic decisions must be brought under democratic control.
It's taking a concept of democracy out of the voting booth and applying it to our everyday physical and economic reality.
And the foundational philosopher Purcell uses to build this argument is the French Marxist sociologist Henri Lefebvre, specifically his concept of the right to the city. And we need to clarify this because when we hear right, we think of the Bill of Rights. We think of a legal document enforced by a judge. But Lefebvre means something much deeper, right?
Yes, Lefebvre is not talking about a civil right granted by a state. He is talking about a fundamental social and spatial claim. Lefebvre beautifully describes the city as an oeuvre, a collective work of art.
I love this concept. Let's really unpack the city as an oeuvre.
Lefebvre argues that urban space is not just an empty container where commerce happens to take place. The city is actively, constantly produced by the daily, physical routines of the people who inhabit it.
When you walk to the bus stop, when you sit on the steps of a library, when a community organizes a street festival, when workers commute and interact.
All of these millions of daily acts of inhabitants literally create the fabric of the city. Therefore, the people who inhabit the city are its true authors. They are the creators of this collective artwork.
And the radical leap in logic here is, because we create the city simply by living our lives in it, we inherently have a right to it. We have a right to the artwork we are collectively authoring.
Right. And in the text, this right to inhabit rests on two main pillars. The first pillar is appropriation.
Appropriation, what does that look like in practice?
Appropriation, in Lefebvre's framework, simply means the right to be physically present in a space, to use it, and to survive in it. It demands that the city serve the needs of inhabitants, the use value, rather than the needs of capital accumulation.
It sounds so incredibly basic, the right to physically exist in a space, but when you look closely at modern cities, this is fiercely contested every single day.
It is perhaps the most heavily policed boundary in urban life. Consider the widespread use of anti-homeless architecture, what is sometimes called hostile architecture.
Right, the bench is designed with metal armrests cutting across the middle.
Specifically designed so a human being cannot lie down and sleep on them. Ledges are studded with metal spikes. Or consider zero-tolerance policing policies that criminalize sitting on a sidewalk, loitering in a public plaza, or washing in a public restroom.
This is exactly where the abstract theory hits reality. A human being has a biological use-value need. They need to sleep. But the city, driven by the need to maximize exchange value, determines that a visible homeless person damages the aesthetic and financial value of a commercial retail district.
So the right of the inhabitant to simply appropriate a piece of public space to survive is outlawed to protect the property values of the stores.
The system criminalizes basic physical survival to maintain clean, orderly commercial spaces. Appropriation is the demand to reverse that priority.
The second pillar of the right to the city goes beyond just being allowed to exist in the space. The second pillar is participation.
And this means what? Having a seat at the planning board.
It means having a central, meaningful, and binding say in the decisions that produce urban space. It is the right of the inhabitants to be the primary decision makers regarding how their collective artwork is developed, overriding the oligarchic boards and the private developers.
Now, at this point, a listener might be thinking, this is a lovely utopian theory, but it's totally impractical. You can't actually run a massive modern city this way.
But Purcell points out that this isn't just theory. There are concrete, real-world examples of this framework being fought for and even codified into law.
He heavily cites the City Statute of Brazil, passed in 2001. How did that work?
The 2001 City Statute in Brazil is a landmark piece of legislation. It was a result of decades of intense grassroots organizing by urban social movements fighting against massive inequality and slum clearances.
What did the statute actually do?
What the statute did was legally codify the social function of the city. It explicitly paired the traditional legal right to private property with the social right of inhabitants to benefit from urban life.
Wait, so it didn't abolish private property? It wasn't a communist revolution?
No, it did not abolish private property. But it established in national law that property rights are not absolute. The right to own and develop land must be balanced against the needs of the community.
Okay, give me an example.
If a wealthy speculator is sitting on empty land in the city center, just waiting for property values to rise, while millions of people lack housing, the statute gave the city the power to force the owner to build on it, or the city could expropriate it for social use.
That is a massive paradigm shift. It legally elevates use value over exchange value. And they didn't just change the property laws, they changed the governance structure through participatory budgeting.
Yes, participatory budgeting is the literal embodiment of Lefebvre's participation pillar. In cities like Porto Alegre, ordinary citizens were given direct, binding democratic control over how a significant percentage of the municipal budget was spent.
It wasn't just a suggestion box or a public comment period.
No. Neighborhood assemblies would gather, debate their priorities. Do we need a paved road, a health clinic, or a school? And their collective decision became law. They bypassed the oligarchic experts and put the fiscal power directly into the hands of the inhabitants.
It proves that the neoliberal framework is not a law of physics. It is a policy choice, and alternative choices are entirely possible when social movements organize and demand them.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the most illuminating part of Purcell's book. We need to see how these theories actually clash on the pavement. This brings us to theory on the ground, where Purcell examines extensive case studies in Seattle and Los Angeles.
These case studies are crucial.
Here's where it gets really interesting. I really want to dig deep into these, because this is where the invisible architecture becomes completely visible. Let's start in Seattle, in late 1999, with the infamous World Trade Organization protests. Set the scene for us. What was happening, and how does it relate to the right to the city?
In November 1999, the World Trade Organization decided to hold its ministerial conference in Seattle. The WTO is, in many ways, the High Council of Global Neoliberalization.
Right.
It is an international body dedicated to reducing trade barriers, enforcing intellectual property rights, and smoothing the pathways for global capital to move freely across borders. To ensure the conference went smoothly, the city of Seattle and federal authorities turned the downtown core into a fortress.
They locked it down.
They established a literal, heavily policed no-protest zone covering dozens of city blocks around the convention center.
So, to protect the architects of global market logic, the city physically enclosed the public space. They suspended the right of inhabitants to appropriate their own downtown.
Exactly. But a massive, incredibly diverse coalition of activists, labor unions, environmentalists, student groups, indigenous rights activists descended on the city. And on the morning the conference was supposed to start, tens of thousands of them actively breached the no-protest zone.
They just marched right in.
They marched into the downtown core, linked arms, locked themselves to heavy equipment, and completely blockaded the intersection surrounding the convention center.
The delegates literally couldn't get out of their hotels to attend the meetings. The opening ceremonies had to be canceled.
It was a profound, physical claiming of the right to appropriation. Purcell specifically highlights a chant that echoed through the streets of Seattle during those days, amidst the tear gas and the riot police. This is what democracy looks like.
That phrase is so powerful in this context. They were saying democracy isn't happening inside that heavily guarded convention center where unelected trade ministers are deciding the fate of the global economy.
And democracy isn't just voting for the mayor who ordered the police to clear the streets.
Right. Democracy looks like this. Citizens physically, bodily appropriating their urban space to resist the logic of the market. They demanded that the city function as a political forum, not just a secure VIP lounge for economic elites.
Now, contrast that moment of radical, disruptive appropriation with what happened in another part of Seattle around the exact same time. This is the case study of the South Lake Union neighborhood.
If the WTO protests were a glimpse of radical democratization, South Lake Union is essentially a textbook manual of how neoliberal urban governance operates.
It really is.
Let's break this down. South Lake Union is a massive area just north of downtown Seattle. Historically, it was a mix of light industry, some housing, a bit neglected, but a single, incredibly powerful corporate entity, Vulcan Real Estate, owned by Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen, began quietly buying up massive tracts of land in the neighborhood, becoming the dominant landowner. What happens next?
What happens next is the perfect illustration of the state acting as an active assistant to capital. To transform South Lake Union from an industrial area into a glittering hub for biotech and tech companies, eventually becoming the home of Amazon's massive urban campus, required an astonishing amount of infrastructure investment.
We are talking about new electrical substations, a new streetcar line, massive road reconfigurations, and utility upgrades.
And Vulcan, the private landowner, didn't pay for all of that themselves.
Not at all.
The city of Seattle, acting as an entrepreneurial economic manager, funneled hundreds of millions of public dollars into this specific neighborhood to build out that infrastructure.
Again, playing devil's advocate. If that investment brings Amazon and thousands of high-paying tech jobs to the city planners would argue they made a brilliant investment that expanded the tax base. Why does Purcell view this as a democratic failure?
Because of the massive opportunity cost and the prioritization of exchange value over use value.
How so?
While the city was mobilizing hundreds of millions of public dollars to massively increase the property values of Vulcan's privately held land in South Lake Union, there were other neighborhoods in Seattle, working-class neighborhoods like Georgetown, Columbia City, Delridge, and South Park that had severe, decades-long infrastructure deficits.
We're talking about neighborhoods that lack the most basic use value necessities. They didn't have functional sidewalks so kids could walk to school safely. They had terrible drainage that caused flooding. They lacked safe public parks.
Exactly. But because fixing a broken sidewalk in the South Park neighborhood does not generate a global competitive advantage for the city, and it doesn't create a massive spike in commercial real estate tax increments, those inhabitants were pushed to the back of the line.
Their use value needs were sacrificed to maximize the exchange value of South Lake Union.
Yes, and the most insidious part of this system is how it learns to co-opt the language of democracy to protect itself from criticism.
This brings us to the third Seattle case study, the redevelopment of the Seattle waterfront. And I found this part of the book chilling because Purcell outlines what he calls the deliberative trap. Tell me how the city handled the waterfront.
In 2001, a major earthquake severely damaged the Alaskan Way Viaduct, a massive elevated highway that separated downtown Seattle from its waterfront.
It was clear the highway had to come down.
It presented a once-in-a-century opportunity to completely redesign the city's relationship to the water. The city initiated a massive redevelopment planning process, and on the surface, it looked like a triumph of participatory democracy.
Right. They didn't just decide in a back room. They held hundreds of public meetings. They had open comment periods. They assembled a massive stakeholder committee with dozens of representatives. They literally set up easels with sticky notes for people to write their dreams for the waterfront. It looked like Lefebvre's dream of participation.
It looked like it. But Purcell reveals that the deck was fundamentally stacked from the beginning. The rules of this deliberative process subtly but firmly dictated that the major property owners and business interests along the waterfront were formal, essential stakeholders who possessed a structural veto.
Meaning they had to be kept happy.
The underlying, unwritten assumption of the entire process was that whatever final design was chosen, it must be acceptable to the major landowners.
So a renter from a neighborhood 3 miles away could come to a public meeting, stand at a microphone for their allotted 3 minutes, and beg for a public park.
But the corporate landowner who owns a high-rise next to the water doesn't have to wait at the microphone. The planners are holding closed-door meetings with them, constantly ensuring that the design won't negatively impact their property values.
The property owners get exactly the exchange value outcomes they want. Massive infrastructure improvements paid for by the public that enhance their land. But crucially, they also get something far more valuable, the ultimate shield of political legitimacy.
Because if activists complain later that the waterfront is too commercialized and caters only to luxury tourists, the city planners can throw their hands up and say, "What are you complaining about? We held 300 public meetings. We have a stakeholder committee. This is the democratic will of the people."
The deliberative trap absorbs the energy of democratic resistance. It exhausts activists in endless meetings that have no real power to challenge market logic, and it uses their participation to rubber stamp the predetermined neoliberal outcome.
It is brilliant, and it is exhausting. But Purcell doesn't just show us the traps. He shows us where inhabitants have successfully navigated them. And that is the case of the Duwamish River cleanup.
The Duwamish is Seattle's main industrial river. Decades of unregulated industrial dumping had left it horribly polluted, eventually leading to it being designated a federal Superfund cleanup site.
In many cities, a Superfund cleanup is handled quietly by a closed-door panel of government agencies and the corporate polluters trying to minimize their financial liability.
But that didn't happen here. A coalition formed called the Duwamish River Cleanup Coalition, or the DRCC. And what is so vital about the DRCC is its intersectionality.
Yes, it wasn't just a traditional mainstream environmental group. The coalition included Native peoples whose historical fishing rights were destroyed by the pollution. It included neighborhood residents from those exact ignored areas we mentioned earlier, like South Park, who suffered high rates of asthma and health issues from the industrial pollution.
It included environmental justice activists and even small local businesses.
They banded together, and they literally forced their way to the table. They claimed a right to participate in the production of their urban environment.
And they demanded that the cleanup standards be dictated by the use value of the river for the people who actually inhabit its banks, meaning the river must be clean enough to safely fish from and play near, rather than just doing the bare minimum required to protect the financial liability of the polluting industries.
And they had significant success in pushing the EPA and the polluters toward more rigorous cleanup standards. What's fascinating here is it demonstrates that when diverse networks of inhabitants unite around a shared claim to physical space, they can successfully insert democratic control back into the economic sphere.
But we have to be incredibly careful here because grassroots mobilization does not automatically equal progressive, radical democratization. And that is why Purcell takes us down the coast to Los Angeles for our final case study, which is a massive cautionary tale. The San Fernando Valley secession movement, known as Valley Vote.
On paper, Valley Vote looks like exactly what Lefebvre was talking about. It was a massive, highly organized grassroots network of inhabitants. They mobilized hundreds of thousands of people in the San Fernando Valley, which is a massive suburban region of Los Angeles.
Their demand was radical. They wanted to secede from the city of Los Angeles entirely and form their own independent municipality. They were demanding local control. They were inhabitants claiming a right to govern their own space.
It sounds like the ultimate right to the city movement. But what was actually motivating them?
Yeah, let's talk about the ideology there.
We have to look at the ideological content of their demand. The San Fernando Valley is generally wealthier, more suburban, and whiter than the rest of Los Angeles. The primary motivation driving the Valley Vote organizers was anti-Keynesian and highly conservative.
They held a deep-seated grievance that their local property taxes were being drained away by the downtown LA bureaucracy to subsidize social services, transit, and infrastructure in the poorer, more diverse areas of the city.
So they weren't trying to create a radically inclusive democratic Uber. They wanted to pull up the drawbridge. They were using the tools of grassroots democracy petitions, neighborhood organizing, town halls to hoard their wealth, protect their property values, and isolate themselves from the broader social needs of the metropolis.
In the Greek framework we discussed earlier, they were acting as idiots.
Exactly. They were mobilizing a massive political movement, but they were doing so strictly to prioritize their private, exclusionary self-interest over the common good of the broader Los Angeles community.
It serves as a stark reminder that the concept of local control is a politically neutral tool. A movement of inhabitants can easily be absorbed by or actively accelerate neoliberal logic if their ultimate goal is just to reinforce property rights, reduce taxes, and privatize public wealth for their own enclave.
If the right to the city isn't tethered to a vision of radical equality, it just becomes another weapon for exclusion.
Which perfectly sets up the broader conclusion of Purcell's work. We need to zoom out and look at how all these specific examples, from Seattle to Los Angeles, connect to broader global systems, and why paying attention to this invisible architecture matters to every single person listening, regardless of what kind of city they live in.
This is the true crisis in perception. How does this system stay invisible? Why don't we see the structural violence of it every day?
Yeah, why do we accept it as normal?
The crisis in perception is maintained by invisible feedback loops that keep the entire system stable and make it appear natural. We've discussed how municipal budgets become utterly dependent on corporate development to survive. Because of that structural dependence, rising property values are automatically and uncritically equated with civic success.
We see this all the time. A shiny new luxury high-rise goes up in a formerly working-class neighborhood. The local news reports it as a boom for the city. The mayor cuts a ribbon. It's framed as revitalization.
Right, because the tax base just went up, which the city desperately needs.
Yeah.
But the displacement of the working class community that used to live on that block, the small businesses that were priced out, the destruction of the neighborhood's historic social fabric, that is treated as an unfortunate accidental side effect.
It is framed as the tragic but inevitable cost of progress.
The feedback loop hides the reality that displacement is not a side effect. It is a direct, intentional feature of a system that mandates the maximization of exchange value. The system makes us think, well, this is just how economies naturally work.
And Purcell is adamant that if we want to build a counterproject, we must broaden our analysis. He insists on intersectionality. Because while neoliberalization is an immensely powerful hegemony, it is not the only one operating in the city. Racism, patriarchy, and heteronormativity are also, as he puts it, shot through the fabric of urban space.
Absolutely. A truly radical right to the city cannot just be about class dynamics and economics. It has to mean the right for all marginalized groups to safely, fully, and joyfully inhabit the city.
Let's look at housing again. If a city manages to push back against developers and builds a massive amount of affordable housing, but that housing is deeply segregated by race due to historical redlining, discriminatory lending, and ongoing systemic racism, then the right to inhabit has not been achieved.
Or think about how physical space is designed. If public transit schedules and routes are designed purely around the needs of 9 to 5 commuters going to the financial district, while ignoring the needs of care workers, who are predominantly women traveling off hours, the city is prioritizing a patriarchal economic model.
If public spaces are unlit and unsafe for women or LGBTQ plus individuals navigating the city at night, their right to the city is violently denied.
The democratic resistance must fight the privilege associated with property rights, yes, but it must simultaneously fight the privilege associated with racial, gender, and sexual hierarchies. The collective artwork of the city is incomplete and broken if vast segments of its inhabitants are barred from participating in its creation.
Furthermore, this struggle extends far beyond the downtown core of major metropolises. The text points towards something much larger, a global right to inhabit.
Yes, the logic of neoliberalization does not stop at the city limits. We must recognize how rural spaces are also heavily modified. Consider the rise of industrial capitalist agriculture. Massive, multinational corporate entities buy up vast tracts of rural land. They dictate food production, animal husbandry, and chemical usage entirely based on the profit imperative of the global market.
It's the exact same logic. Its highest and best use applied to the global food supply. The small family farmers, the indigenous communities, the local rural inhabitants are squeezed out, bought out, or poisoned by agricultural runoff, just like the working class renters in South Lake Union are squeezed out by tech campuses.
Their use value need for a healthy environment and sustainable food production is overridden by the exchange value needs of global agribusiness.
The right to inhabit applies just as urgently to a rural farming community fighting a corporate megafarm as it does to an urban neighborhood fighting a luxury developer. The battlefield is everywhere because the system is everywhere.
And this is why shifting our perception, gaining this new lens, is so critical. If we only look at the surface, we see a fragmented, chaotic world of isolated local problems. A housing crisis here, a polluted river there, a bankrupt farm over there.
But if we look at the structural architecture that Purcell outlines, we see a unified global logic of neoliberalization. And once you can actually see that logic, you can begin to imagine a unified global resistance based on the fundamental right of all people to democratically inhabit their spaces.
It connects local struggles. It means that whether you are fighting for a safe crosswalk in your neighborhood, advocating for a community garden, or organizing a massive tenant union to stop evictions, you are not just tinkering with local policy, you are part of a much larger global struggle to recapture democracy.
You are pushing back against a system that views your home, your neighborhood, and your life purely as an economic asset to be optimized. And you are demanding the right to participate in the physical spaces you live in.
Indeed. True democracy requires far more than just casting a ballot every few years for a politician whose hands are tied by the bond market. It requires an active, daily, relentless engagement in the production of our shared environment.
As we wrap up this deep dive, we want to remind you of our core mission. Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly. This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon. For a shorter, visual overview of this topic, see the mini-explainer linked in the description. If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.
Before we go, I want to leave you with one final, provocative thought, drawn from a brief but vital example toward the end of Purcell's text. We have spent this entire time talking about the physical city parks, sidewalks, housing, and rivers. But Purcell briefly applies this concept of radical democratization to information technology.
IT, how does that work?
He points to open-source software, specifically contrasting a collectively produced tool like Mozilla Firefox with a proprietary, corporate-owned tool like Microsoft Explorer. In the open-source model, users collectively produce, refine, debug, and democratize a digital space based on their use value needs, not corporate profit.
That is a massive paradigm shift, taking Lefebvre's right to the city and applying it to the internet.
It raises a profound question for our modern era. If we must fight so intensely for the right to inhabit our physical cities, what happens when we apply this exact same lens to the digital cities we inhabit every single day?
The platform.
Think about the massive social media platforms, the search algorithms, the digital public squares, where we now conduct almost all of our democratic discourse. Are these spaces already fully privatized? When we log on, are we merely acting as idiots, generating behavioral data and exchange value for a handful of tech monopolies, or are we acting as citizens?
That is a fantastic question.
And ultimately, if we are the ones creating the content and the connections that make these platforms valuable, what would a true right to the digital city look like?
That is something to seriously mull over the next time you log on to your favorite platform. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the systems around you.